Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're digging into a really big topic, one that's been central to economic debates for decades now. Trickle-down economics.
Right. We've got a bunch of sources here, articles, some research papers, notes, and we're going to use them to track this idea.
Yeah. We'll look back at the Reagan era, then jump to the Trump tax cuts in 2017, and even look ahead at what's being proposed for 2025.
Our goal here really is to walk you through this material. We want to unpack the basic theory, what it's supposed to do.
And then compare that to what the sources say actually happened. The stated goals versus the reported results.
Exactly. And crucially, how these policies seem to affect people at different income levels. We'll also get into the nitty-gritty of how some future plans might actually be funded.
So what are the key takeaways when you put all this information together? Let's dive in.
Okay, so let's start at maybe the modern beginning. Reaganomics in the 80s. What's the core idea behind trickle-down as described in our sources?
Well, the fundamental theory, as it's laid out, is that if you cut taxes significantly, especially for corporations and the wealthy, and maybe ease up on regulations, that frees up capital. The idea is they'll invest that money, expand businesses, create jobs.
And that prosperity eventually, trickles down to everyone else in the economy. That's the promise.
Okay, the promise. So what did the sources say about the results back then, during the Reagan years? What did the numbers actually show?
Well, looking back, supporters and some analyses point to some positive signs. The top tax rate, for instance, was cut dramatically. It went from 70% down to 28% between 81 and 88.
Wow, that's a huge drop.
It really was. And during that time, the sources note real GNP, gross national product adjusted for inflation, grew by about 26%.
Okay.
The economy also added something like 20 million jobs. Unemployment fell quite a bit, from 7.6% down to 5.5%.
And I think the sources mentioned specific gains for African-American employment.
Yes, reportedly up around 25%. So on the surface, you see these positive economic indicators.
But, as often happens, the sources we looked at paint a more, let's say, complex picture. There were downsides reported too, right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. The other side of the coin, according to the material, was a sharp increase in deficits. The national debt actually tripled during that period.
Tripled? Wow.
Yeah. And while they initially tried to close some corporate tax loopholes, the sources suggest many of those found ways to reappear later on.
And what about inequality? That's often linked to this era.
That's a really consistent finding in the sources. Socioeconomic inequality reportedly widened quite significantly during the Reagan years.
And the sources connect this back to the tax cuts, or at least question the link between the cuts and broad benefits.
They do. We see analyses and scholars arguing that, okay, the economy grew, but there isn't really clear proof in the data that the tax cuts themselves were the main reason for income gains for most people.
So the benefits were maybe more concentrated.
Yep, that's what they suggest, yeah. More concentrated at the very top.
Okay, let's fast forward a bit. We see a similar philosophy guiding the Trump administration's big tax law in 2017, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the TCJA. What were the key changes there based on our sources?
The big headline item was definitely the corporate tax rate, slashed from 35% way down to 21%.
Huge cut.
Massive. And it also included cuts to individual income taxes, including the top rate, although those were set to be temporary.
And the rationale, the promise behind it, was it that same trickle-down idea again?
Fundamentally, yes. The sources report the stated goal was familiar: encourage businesses to invest, create jobs, boost wages, stimulate growth that benefits everyone.
So the same promise. What did the independent analyses cited in our sources find actually happened? Who really gained from the TCJA?
This is where the findings get pretty stark. Independent reviews consistently showed the lion's share of the benefits went to the top.
The wealthiest 1%.
Received the biggest slice, yeah. Meanwhile, the middle class reportedly saw pretty minimal gains, and the poorest households, they got the least.
What about wages? Did wages go up for average workers?
The data suggests not much, if at all, for low-skilled workers. Any significant wage growth reported was more concentrated among executives and, high earners.
And these cuts obviously cost money. They weren't free.
Not at all. The sources highlight significant fiscal costs, bigger deficits, and less overall government revenue than projected before the cuts.
Right. And this is a critical point the sources really dig into. Where did that money, the savings from the tax cuts, actually flow? Did it go into worker paychecks or broad reinvestment?
Well, based on the evidence presented across the sources, it seems most of the gains, especially from the corporate side, didn't widely reach employees.
So where did it go?
A lot of it reportedly went to shareholders. Things like stock buybacks became much more common.
Which boosts the stock price, benefiting owners.
Exactly. And compensation for top executives also saw increases. Some wealth was also reportedly moved offshore or shielded using, complex tax strategies.
So companies spent money on accountants and lawyers to minimize taxes rather than necessarily broad investment.
That's what the sources suggest, yeah. Significant resources went into navigating the tax code to shelter that wealth.
Okay, so that brings us to the present, or potential future. Former President Trump is proposing a new bill for 2025, sometimes called the One Big Beautiful Bill. What are its main components, according to our source material?
Well, the core idea is to make those 2017 TCJA cuts permanent. The individual tax rate cuts were temporary, remember? This would extend them indefinitely.
Along with the corporate rate staying low.
Right. And it also reportedly throws in some new deductions for tips, for overtime pay, even for auto loans.
Okay, so what does the independent analysis like the Penn-Wharton budget model cited in the sources say about who wins and who loses under this proposed plan?
The distributional effects they estimate are pretty dramatic. They project that low-income families could actually lose about $1,500 a year.
Lose money?
No, we'll get into the safety net impacts, but yeah, a net loss. While at the other end, the ultra-wealthy could potentially gain around $100,000 a year.
Wow. So potentially widening inequality even further.
That's the reported outcome, yes. Reinforcing those existing gaps.
And the impact on the national debt? Extending cuts, adding deductions? That sounds expensive.
Hugely expensive. All sources agree the deficit would jump significantly. The estimates vary a bit, but we're talking trillions.
Trillions?
Yeah, the CBO, that's the Congressional Budget Office, figures just extending the TCJA costs about $2.4 trillion over 10 years. Another source puts the total impact closer to $3.8 trillion added to the debt, which is already around $36 trillion.
That level of debt increase usually puts pressure on government spending, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And the sources explicitly flag concerns about safety net programs. Things like Medicaid, SNP, food assistance, they become vulnerable to spending cuts down the line to try and manage that debt.
And economists are weighing in.
Yes, the material mentions economists, including Nobel laureates, warning that this kind of bill risks worsening both inequality and fiscal stability for the country.
You mentioned safety nets. The Reuters source had some very specific details about how lower-income families might be affected beyond just that $1,500 figure.
It did. The analysis points to worries about millions potentially losing Medicaid or ACA health coverage, maybe 8.7 million people.
That's huge.
It is. And there are also changes noted for things like the child tax credit. Requiring a Social Security number could exclude about 4.5 million kids who currently qualify. Similar issues with the earned income tax credit.
And navigating all this could get harder.
That's another concern raised. If IRS funding is cut, as has been proposed, it could be much tougher for low-income folks who often have complicated situations relative to their income to actually get the credits they're entitled to.
So it's a double whammy, potentially.
Kind of. The Penn-Wharton analysis even tried to calculate a lifetime impact, estimating low-income households could lose out on $8,500 over their lifetimes due to a weaker safety net combined with the burden of higher national debt.
Let's quickly touch on that specific tip deduction proposal. It sounds good for waiters or bartenders on the surface.
Yes, the idea is workers earning up to $160,000 could deduct tips from their income tax until 2029. They'd still pay Social Security and Medicare taxes, though.
But does it help everyone who gets tips?
Well, that's the catch highlighted in the sources. Around 37% of tipped workers actually earn too little to owe any federal income tax in the first place. So for them, this deduction doesn't really help.
I see. And it still costs the government money.
Oh, yeah. Nearly $40 billion in lost revenue estimated through 2028.
Okay, so if these tax cuts are so expensive, where do the sources say the money is supposed to come from to pay for this bill? I think you mentioned tariffs earlier.
That's right. Tariffs are presented as a key part of the funding plan. The suggestion has been made that tariffs could raise enough money to cover the tax cuts, maybe even eventually replace the income tax entirely.
Replace the income tax. Wow. Okay, what does the budget maps and the sources say about that? Can tariffs realistically cover these costs?
It's interesting. The CBO estimates that the tariffs Trump has announced could potentially bring in about $2.5 trillion over 10 years.
Which is roughly the cost CBO estimated for extending the tax cuts.
Exactly, about $2.4 trillion. So on paper, in that specific CBO projection, they sort of balance out. Other estimates vary, maybe $3.1 trillion from all announced tariffs, or $2.17 trillion from just a 10% universal tariff.
So maybe the numbers could work on paper.
Yeah.
But the sources seemed really critical of relying on tariffs like this. Phrases like, not much of a bargain, very dangerous way to raise revenue.
Yes, that's the big counterargument running through the material. Even if the projections line up, there are major problems flagged with using tariffs as your primary funding source.
What are the main issues raised?
Well, first, the revenue itself is seen as pretty unstable. Tariffs are often put in place by executive order. A new president or Congress could just reverse them.
Okay. Not a reliable long-term source.
Right. And there are legal challenges, too. The sources mention a court ruling in New York, for example, that could potentially block tariffs. So you can't really count on that money long-term.
What about the economic effects of the tariffs themselves?
That's probably the biggest critique. Tariffs are basically taxes on imported goods. So while they're aimed at foreign companies, the cost usually gets passed right along to American consumers.
Higher prices for us.
Higher prices on pretty much everything that's imported, yeah. Plus, they hurt U.S. manufacturers who rely on imported parts, makes them less competitive.
And what about other countries? Don't they usually retaliate?
Invariably.
Yeah.
They slap tariffs on U.S. exports, which hurts American businesses trying to sell overseas, farmers, manufacturers, you name it. The EU response is mentioned as an example.
So it sounds like a trade war dynamic.
Pretty much. One source quotes economists calling it a really bad trade, even perhaps the dumbest tax reform, because of these wide-ranging negative effects.
It seems like it could isolate the U.S. economy, too.
That's another point raised. It might discourage foreign investment. Remember, foreigners hold about 30% of U.S. debt. If they pull back because of trade tensions or instability,
it could cost the U.S. government more to borrow money.
Exactly, higher borrowing costs for the government. It's why one source calls tariffs maybe the most economically damaging way to raise taxes.
And how does this tariff approach tie back to the inequality issue we were discussing with the tax cuts?
This is a really crucial connection the sources make. Tariffs are inherently regressive.
Meaning they hit lower income people harder.
Yes, because they're a tax on consumption on things people buy. Lower income folks spend a much larger chunk of their income just on basic goods compared to wealthier people. So tariffs hit their budgets disproportionately hard.
Are there estimates on that impact?
Yeah, the Yale Budget Lab estimated average consumers might pay around $2,800 more per year because of tariffs. But for those at the bottom, it's like losing $1,300 in purchasing power.
So you potentially have tax cuts benefiting the wealthy, safety net cuts hitting the poor, and then tariffs acting as a regressive tax increase on top of it all.
That's the picture painted in the sources, yes. Layering that regressive tax increase onto potential safety net cuts makes low and middle income households, quote, substantially worse off. And again, tariffs are called a very unreliable source of revenue that causes a lot more economic harm than other ways of raising money.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, but related, the sources also touched on Trump's bring back jobs agenda, specifically in manufacturing, and the role of automation. What's the tension there?
It's a really important point. The goal is often stated as bringing manufacturing jobs back, but modern manufacturing looks very different than it used to. It relies heavily on automation, on robotics.
So bringing a factory back doesn't automatically mean bringing back lots of human jobs.
Exactly. A new factory might employ far fewer people than an older one did because machines are doing more of the work. Research cited shows automation often displaces lower-skilled jobs.
So just reshoring isn't enough.
Right. Without creating new kinds of roles and really investing in retraining the workforce for those roles, you might not see a big jump in overall employment, especially for those whose old jobs disappeared.
And this relates to competing globally, like with China.
Yes, that's the challenge. If the U.S. doesn't effectively use automation and invest heavily in upskilling its workers, American companies could lose out to competitors like China who are heavily automating.
But just automating without training workers could cause problems too.
Definitely. The sources warn that random automation without a plan for the workforce can actually make inequality worse domestically, leaving many workers behind.
So what's the suggested path forward in the sources?
It points towards a balanced approach. You need investment in technology, including automation, but it has to go hand in hand with serious, robust investment in workforce development, training, and education.
To compete globally and create opportunity at home.
That's the argument presented. You need both tech adoption and human capital investment working together.
Okay, let's try to pull all this together. Looking across all these sources, Reagan, TCJA, the 2025 proposals, What are the main recurring themes or bottom line points?
Well, a really consistent thread is that these trickle-down models, both historically under Reagan and with the 2017 TCJA, have reportedly tended to benefit the wealthy disproportionately.
And coincided with widening inequality.
Yes. The sources consistently report a widening gap. And the wealth generated or saved through the tax cuts. It often seems to flow into shareholder value, executive pay, or, offshore accounts and tax avoidance strategies.
Rather than broad wage increases or benefits for the average worker.
That's the pattern the evidence suggests, yes. Less broad-based benefit than promise.
And looking at the proposed 2025 plan?
The analyses we reviewed suggest it risks doubling down on that trend. Projections show potential losses for low and middle income families, significant gains for the wealthiest, all while adding trillions to the deficit.
Which then puts pressure on spending for things like safety nets.
Exactly. And the job picture is complicated by automation. Just bringing factories back isn't a magic bullet if it's mostly robots doing the work and the workforce isn't prepared for new roles.
So the overall message seems to be that competitiveness and broad prosperity require more than just tax cuts.
That's what the sources collectively suggest. A balanced approach involving tech investment and serious workforce development seems crucial.
And the sources did include political reactions too, didn't they? Like the Democrat view on the 2025 proposal.
Right. The Guardian piece, for example, quoted Democrats calling it things like a cruel and dangerous scheme, fiscally irresponsible and regressive.
With the specific concern that it makes lower-income people worse off to fund tax cuts for the rich.
That was the core criticism highlighted, yes. That it transfers wealth upward while undermining fiscal stability.
Wow. Okay, this has been quite the journey through these sources. From Reagan's initial theory to the real-world data from the TCJA, and now looking at these detailed analyses of what might come next with the 2025 proposals, including how things like tariffs and automation fit in. It really underscores how complex these policies are and how differently they can impact various groups.
It certainly does. Digging into the material shows you really need to look past the headlines and the promises to understand the reported effects and the mechanics behind it all.
So, thinking about everything we've covered from these sources, the history, the reported outcomes, the projections for the future, what does it really mean for you, listening now, to be truly well-informed about where economic policy might be headed and how it could affect different people? And maybe more importantly, what questions does this deep dive leave you wrestling with about how we strike that fundamental balance between tax cuts, government spending, the national debt, and the persistent challenge of inequality in our society?